At first glance, nothing was wrong. The room was calm, almost comforting in its order. A long wooden table, pencils sharpened to fine points, coffee gone lukewarm. On the wall, a large operational map stood like an altar to certainty, its clean lines and precise symbols offering reassurance to every man who looked at it. This was how control was supposed to feel. The front line was there, solid, continuous, drawn with confidence. Enemy forces were marked exactly where intelligence said they should be, far to the west, safely contained. Supply routes ran clean and uninterrupted. Rear areas were quiet, predictable, safe. For the officers in that room, this map was more than ink and paper. It was memory. It was habit. It was proof that experience still mattered in a war that had already swallowed so many certainties. These men had survived earlier campaigns by trusting systems, by believing that if the map was correct, the war was still understandable. And that belief was powerful. It shaped posture. It shaped tone. It shaped decisions. No one raised their voice. No one rushed. Small adjustments were made with the confidence of men who believed the world still obeyed rules. A unit marker slid half a mile. A note was added. A bridge marked destroyed. Routine corrections to a reality they believed they still controlled. But here is the unsettling truth, the kind that only reveals itself after the damage is done. The map was already lying, not because anyone falsified it, not because someone failed at their job. It lied because it reflected a world that no longer existed. It showed where the war had been hours, maybe days earlier. It offered certainty at the exact moment certainty had become the most dangerous illusion of all. Outside that room, events were unfolding at a speed the map could not capture. Columns were moving, roads were changing hands, assumptions were dying quietly without explosions or warnings. Inside the room, the officers leaned closer to the map, unaware that the war had already slipped past them, and that is the moment that should make you uneasy, because the most catastrophic failures do not begin with panic. They begin with confidence. Before we go any further, take a second to support the channel. If you value deep, thoughtful stories like this, stories that go beyond battles and into the human cost of command, hit subscribe. It helps the channel grow and gives us the motivation to keep bringing you history that actually matters. Now, a quick question for you. Which is more dangerous in war? A. Not having enough information. B. Having information that feels complete, but is wrong. Comment A or B below. I want to see what you think before the story continues. The report arrived without drama, which is why it was so dangerous. A junior officer took the call, listened, and frowned, not with fear but with mild irritation. He asked the caller to slow down, then to repeat the location. When the receiver went back into place, he stood for a moment, as if weighing whether the message even deserved to be passed on. According to the report, American armored vehicles had been sighted near a town that lay far behind German lines. Not near the front, not along a contested road, deep in territory that, according to every map in the room, was secure. The officer walked to the map and found the place with his finger. He measured the distance carefully, nearly 40 miles from the front line. He checked the scale again, just to be sure the math was correct. The report was not that was the only reasonable conclusion, He marked nothing. Instead, he wrote a small note in his log and moved on. In war, mistakes happened constantly. Drivers misread signs. Units confused villages with similar names. A single bad report meant nothing unless it was confirmed. But confirmation came quickly. A second call reported the same thing. Then a third. Different units, different directions, the same impossible claim. The room grew quieter, not because anyone panicked, but because no one knew what to say. The map offered no explanation. The front line was intact. Rear areas were clearly marked and calm. There was no indication of a breakthrough, no sign of collapse, No reason for enemy armor to be where it was being reported. Experienced officers searched for explanations that preserved order. Faulty radios, nervous troops, overactive imaginations. Someone reminded the room that reacting too quickly to unverified information had doomed commands before. Another pointed out that discipline meant trusting the system, not rumors. All of that was true, and yet the reports kept coming. What made this moment so unsettling was not the possibility that the reports were accurate. It was the realization that, if they were, then something far more serious had already occurred without anyone noticing. Accepting the reports meant accepting that the map, so carefully maintained, so deeply trusted, was no longer describing reality. That kind of realization does not arrive with explosions. It arrives quietly in the pause between sentences, in the way men avoid each other's eyes, in the sudden awareness that certainty has become fragile. The officers did not know it yet, but this was the moment the war stopped making sense. And once a war stops making sense, it does not wait for permission to finish unraveling. The unease did not arrive as a single revelation. It accumulated. By late afternoon, the headquarters was no longer reacting to one strange report, then another. It was reacting to absences. A fuel convoy that should have arrived hours ago did not. A courier sent forward failed to return. A maintenance unit reported delays it could not explain. A field telephone line went dead. Then another, each failure small enough to dismiss, yet collectively impossible to ignore. Rear areas are supposed to be predictable. That is their purpose. They exist to remove uncertainty from war, to create spaces where planning can breathe. When rear areas function properly, commanders stop thinking about them altogether. When they do not, something fundamental has already gone wrong. What troubled the staff officers most was not the disruptions themselves, but where they were happening. These were not contested roads near the front, not zones under artillery fire. They were occurring deep inside territory the map labeled as secure, places where drivers should not hesitate, where supply schedules should hold, where communication lines should be boring in their reliability. One officer began noting each incident on a separate sheet, not to alarm anyone, but to bring order to the confusion. Patterns matter in war. Coincidences do not repeat this cleanly. The pattern formed quickly. Every disruption traced back to the same broad region, miles behind the front line. Not clustered tightly, but spread just enough to suggest movement, direction, intent. The logistics staff felt it first. They always did. Combat units deal in violence. Logistics deals in reality. Fuel, food, time, distance. These things do not lie. When trucks vanish and schedules collapse, the war is speaking in its most honest language. Still, no one said the unthinkable out loud. They searched instead for explanations that preserved order. Overloaded roads, civilian interference, mechanical failures, temporary confusion that would correct itself by morning. These explanations were not foolish. They were responsible. They were what disciplined professionals were supposed to offer. But beneath the professionalism, something shifted. Conversations lowered. Eyes lingered longer on the map. Officers began asking questions that had nothing to do with doctrine and everything to do with instinct. Why here? Why now? Why behind us? The map still showed rear areas as calm, untouched, obedient to plan. Yet reality was behaving differently, erratically, unpredictably, as if those spaces had quietly changed roles without informing anyone in command. This was the moment when the staff stopped asking whether the reports were wrong. They began wondering what else the map was no longer telling them. And once rear areas stopped behaving like rear areas, the war is no longer where you think it is. By the time the staff gathered to confront what was happening, the room carried a different weight. The map was still there, The procedures were still being followed, but the confidence that once bound them together had begun to thin, replaced by something more fragile, doubt restrained by discipline. Doctrine stood at the center of the discussion like an unspoken authority. For decades, it had provided structure to chaos. It explained how fronts held, how breakthroughs happened, how deep penetrations were detected and contained. Doctrine said that what they were beginning to suspect could not happen without warning. It said there would be signs, collapsed units, frantic radio traffic, unmistakable pressure at the front. None of that had appeared. That was the problem. Some officers argued firmly for caution. Doctrine existed for a reason, they said. Armies that abandoned it too quickly often imagined threats that were not there. History was full of commands undone not by enemies, but by overreaction. Trust the system, trust the map, trust experience. Others listened in silence, troubled not by the arguments themselves, but by how desperately necessary they felt. These men had seen war change before. They knew that doctrine was built on yesterday's lessons, and yesterday was no longer available for consultation. The unthinkable idea hovered just beneath the surface. What if the enemy had not attacked the front at all? What if they had simply ignored it? That thought carried a particular kind of fear. Not the fear of defeat, but the fear of irrelevance. If true, it meant the staff had been studying the wrong problem while the real one moved freely through the gaps. Doctrine had trained them to recognize danger when it looked familiar. It had not prepared them for a threat that refused to announce itself. No one spoke the conclusion aloud. Not yet, but the room had crossed an invisible line. From this moment on, the greatest danger was no longer the enemy's strength. It was the possibility that everything they believed about how this war worked was already out of date. The collapse did not announce itself with explosions or enemy fire. It announced itself with silence. At first it was a single missed response, a routine check-in that went unanswered. No one overreacted. Radios failed. Lines were cut. War was hard on equipment. The communications officers followed procedure, testing circuits, rerouting signals, adjusting frequencies. Everything on their end worked exactly as it should. That was what made the silence so unsettling. Within hours, failures began clustering. A division command post could no longer be reached. Then a regiment. Then an entire sector went quiet. Not gradually, but all at once. Switchboards filled with red marks. Operators looked at one another, searching for a technical explanation that would make sense of what they were seeing. There wasn't one. The equipment was intact. The wires were still there. Radios still transmitted. But messages no longer arrived where they were supposed to go. Calls that should have taken seconds now disappeared into nothing. Routes that had carried orders for years suddenly led nowhere. The realization came slowly, and then all at once. The network had not failed mechanically. It had failed geographically. Every communication system is built on assumptions about who controls which roads, which towns, which stretches of ground. The German network assumed those assumptions were still true. But the war had already rewritten the map, and the network had not been told. Messages weren't failing because the system was broken. They were failing because the world it was designed to operate in no longer existed. For the communications officers, this was a professional and personal reckoning. They were trained to restore order, to fix disruptions, to keep information flowing. Now they faced a problem that could not be repaired with tools or procedure. They could not reconnect a command to units whose locations were no longer certain. As the silence spread, headquarters began to understand the full weight of what was happening. An army can fight without perfect information. It cannot fight without awareness. And on that day, awareness began slipping away, quietly, relentlessly, line by line, call by call, until command itself became an echo with no one left to hear it. Headquarters did not fall silent when certainty disappeared. It grew busier. Orders continued to be drafted, reviewed, and transmitted with professional care. That in itself was part of the danger. The machinery of command was still functioning, even as its foundation was eroding. Maps were consulted, timetables referenced, procedures followed. From the outside, it looked like control. Inside, it felt like guessing. Messages went out to units that might already be surrounded. Instructions were issued to hold positions that may no longer exist as coherent points on the battlefield. Supply movements were planned along routes no one could confirm were still open. Each order carried authority, and with it, responsibility, but not certainty. The staff officers understood what this meant, even if they never said it aloud. Every directive now risked becoming a liability. To order a unit forward might be to send it into isolation. To order it to hold might be to trap it. And yet, to issue no orders at all felt like abdication. Command does not vanish just because information does. It lingers. And that lingering is cruel. Phones rang with questions headquarters could not answer. Where are friendly lines? Is withdrawal authorized? Is relief coming? The men asking were not panicking. They were doing what disciplined soldiers do, seeking guidance. That made the silence on the other end of the line heavier. Inside the operations room, decisions were debated with care that bordered on restraint. Officers weighed every word, every phrase, knowing that clarity was slipping through their fingers. Some orders were softened, others delayed. None felt sufficient. This was leadership stripped of its most essential tool, awareness. The staff was no longer directing the battle. They were reacting to shadows of it, issuing instructions based on assumptions that grew thinner by the hour. Authority still existed, but it floated free of understanding, untethered from the ground truth it depended on. An army can endure fear. It can endure losses. What it cannot endure for long is command that continues to speak confidently after it has lost the ability to see. And in that moment, orders still moved outward, even as knowledge quietly vanished inward. The decision did not come with argument or drama. It came with resignation. For hours, the staff had tried to preserve the map as it was, adjusting markers, adding notes, circling uncertainties. But the contradictions kept multiplying. Units reported positions that no longer connected to anything. Routes assumed to be safe could not be confirmed. Large areas of the board had not received a single reliable update in an entire day. At some point, preserving the front line became an act of fiction. The senior officer stood in front of the map longer than usual, studying the thick blue line that had once represented order. That line had meaning only if the space behind it was secure and the space in front of it contested. Neither assumption could be defended anymore. Quietly, the instruction was given. Remove it. A staff officer hesitated for just a moment, grease pencil poised in midair. Erasing the front line felt wrong, not tactically but emotionally. That line was more than a boundary. It was proof that the war was still organized, still legible. Once it was gone, there would be nothing to hide behind. The pencil moved. When the line disappeared, the map changed instantly from misleading to honest, and that honesty was brutal. What remained were isolated symbols scattered across wide, empty spaces, units without neighbors, positions without context, vast areas marked not with control but with uncertainty. The room fell silent. This was not defeat in the traditional sense. No breakthrough arrow, no collapse marked in red. Instead, there was absence. The absence of continuity, the absence of confidence, the absence of a battlefield that could be described with straight lines. By erasing the front line, the staff acknowledged something far more difficult than loss. They acknowledged ignorance. They no longer knew where the enemy was. Worse, they no longer knew where they themselves truly were. Yet there was a strange clarity in that admission. The map no longer lied. It no longer offered comfort. It offered only what could be confirmed, and nothing more. That moment marked the true turning point, not when ground was lost, but when the illusion of control was finally surrendered. From then on, every decision would be made in the open, staring directly into the blank spaces where certainty used to live. The calls began after midnight. They came one at a time, slipping through the remaining fragments of the communications network like messages from another world. The voices on the other end were calm, disciplined, controlled. That was what made them so difficult to hear. A battalion commander reported enemy vehicles moving on roads behind his position. He spoke carefully, as if choosing the right words might restore order. His men were still in place, defensive positions held. Orders had been followed precisely. He wanted to know if this was a temporary situation or if withdrawal was authorized. Headquarters searched for an answer that did not exist. Another call followed, a unit asking about a supply convoy promised days earlier. Ammunition was low, food nearly gone. They had assumed delays were temporary. They were still assuming relief would come. They asked for confirmation, not reassurance. Each call carried the same unspoken belief that somewhere above them, someone still understood the whole picture. But the picture was gone. These units had not been defeated. They had not broken. They were doing exactly what they had been trained to do, holding ground, maintaining discipline, waiting for orders. The war, however, had moved past them. It had flowed around their positions, severed their connections, and left them standing inside a moment that no longer mattered. The most painful calls were the simplest ones. Where are friendly lines? Which direction is safe? Are we still part of the front? There was no honest way to answer. Inside headquarters, the staff listened in silence after each receiver was placed back on the hook. No one spoke right away. Giving guidance without knowledge felt like betrayal. Saying nothing felt worse. Eventually, commanders began telling subordinates to use their own judgment, break out if possible, hold if necessary, surrender if survival demanded it. These were not orders. They were admissions. In that moment, command dissolved into something quieter and more tragic, acknowledgement that loyalty had outlasted relevance. That men were still fighting a war whose structure no longer existed, and that some would never know when the war passed them by. Only that it never came back. Clarity arrived slowly, and by the time it did, it no longer offered solutions, only explanations. In the quiet hours between calls, the staff began to see the pattern that had eluded them for days. There had been no decisive breakthrough, no single moment when the front had shattered. What had happened was far more subtle and far more devastating. The enemy had not focused on destroying units. They had focused on outrunning understanding. American forces had moved faster than the German command system could observe, process, and respond. While reports traveled up, chains of command and decisions worked their way back down. The battlefield itself had already changed. The war did not pause for confirmation. It did not wait for maps to be updated. The staff realized that they had been reacting to echoes. Every order issued had addressed a situation that no longer existed. Every report analyzed described positions that had already become irrelevant. The map had not been wrong in pieces. It had been wrong as a whole. Assembled from fragments of information that were individually plausible but collectively false. This was not failure born of incompetence. The officers understood that now. Procedures had been followed. Discipline had been maintained. Decisions had been made according to doctrine. And yet doctrine itself had been overtaken by tempo. The enemy had turned speed into a weapon. By bypassing strong points instead of engaging them. By flowing through gaps rather than forcing breaches, they had attacked the German army's ability to comprehend the fight. Units were not defeated in battle. They were isolated in time. Cut off from relevance before they even knew they were at risk. That realization carried a particular bitterness, not the bitterness of loss, but of belated understanding. The knowledge that if this insight had come earlier, choices might have been different, withdrawals might have been ordered, Lives might have been spared, but insight delayed is insight denied. In the end, the staff understood the truth that haunted them most. The army had not been beaten by firepower alone. It had been defeated by a future that arrived faster than anyone was prepared to recognize. And by the time they understood that, the war they thought they were fighting was already over. When the headquarters finally dissolved, there was no dramatic ending, no final stand, no clear moment of closure. Maps were taken down, documents burned, radios destroyed. The machinery of command quietly dismantled itself and moved east, leaving behind scattered units still fighting battles that no longer had meaning. That is why this story matters. It is tempting to see this episode as a failure unique to its time, an outdated army overwhelmed by a faster one. But that explanation is too comfortable and too narrow. What happened here was not simply a military defeat. It was a human one, a systemic one. And those do not belong to history alone. The officers involved were not reckless, they were not ignorant, they were experienced professionals who trusted the tools and processes that had served them for years. The tragedy was not that they acted wrongly, but that they acted correctly for a world that no longer existed. That danger has not disappeared. Modern institutions, military, corporate, governmental, still rely on dashboards, reports, metrics, and models to explain reality. Those tools are powerful. They are also seductive. They create confidence. They reward order. And when change accelerates, they can become dangerously reassuring. This story reminds us that awareness is not the same as information. That procedure is not the same as understanding. And that control can feel strongest at the exact moment it has already slipped away. The soldiers who called in, still disciplined, still loyal, still waiting for guidance, believed they were part of something coherent. They deserved better than silence. They deserved leaders who could see as clearly as they could fight. For an American audience today, this is not a warning about arrogance. It is a warning about tempo, about adaptability, about the cost of trusting systems longer than reality deserves. History does not repeat itself precisely, but it does echo, and the echo of this story is simple, unsettling, and enduring. The greatest failures often begin not with chaos, but with confidence that goes unquestioned for just a little too long. The story you've just heard is not really about maps, radios, or even armies. It is about people, experienced, disciplined professionals who did everything they were taught to do, yet still found themselves overtaken by events they could no longer see. The German staff officers at the center of this story were not careless men. They were methodical, cautious, and deeply committed to order. They trusted their systems because those systems had worked before. Maps had given them clarity. Doctrine had given them confidence. Procedures had given them control. For years, these tools had turned chaos into something manageable. And that was precisely the problem. As the battlefield changed faster than information could move, the officers continued to operate inside a version of reality that felt solid but was already gone. Reports arrived too late. Decisions addressed problems that no longer existed. Orders were issued to units that had already been bypassed. The war did not defeat them with overwhelming force. It defeated them by outrunning their understanding. The most tragic element of this story lies in the human dimension. Soldiers on the ground remained disciplined and loyal, holding positions, following orders, believing they were part of a coherent plan. Their faith in the system outlasted the system itself. By the time headquarters understood what had happened, it could no longer help them. The lesson here is uncomfortable, but essential. In modern life, we all rely on systems, data dashboards, performance metrics, routines, assumptions built on past success. Like those officers, we are often rewarded for trusting these structures. They give us confidence. They make complexity feel controllable. But when change accelerates, those same systems can quietly become liabilities. The deeper lesson is this. Information is not awareness, and confidence is not control. True awareness requires constant questioning, humility, and the courage to doubt even the tools that once served us well. Whether in leadership, business, relationships, or personal decision-making, the danger is not being wrong, it is being comfortably wrong for too long. History reminds us that collapse rarely announces itself loudly. More often, it arrives disguised as normalcy. Now, a question for you. What is more dangerous in times of rapid change? A. Acting without enough information. B. Acting confidently on outdated information. Comment A or B below. And more importantly, what do you think this story says about leadership and decision-making today? Share your perspective in the comments so others can learn from it too. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to the channel and support the work. It helps us keep bringing you thoughtful, human-centered history that connects the past to the world we're living in now.